The morning sun streamed through the expansive windows of San Francisco International Airport, casting long shadows over the bustling terminal. Olivia Harris, 34, moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. Her blonde hair was tucked under a black cap, and her athletic frame was dressed simply in a dark gray sweatshirt and light gray sweatpants. A modest silver bracelet on her left wrist was the only piece of jewelry she wore. To the casual observer, she could have been any other traveler prioritizing comfort over style for a long flight. No one would have guessed that she was married to James Harris, a billionaire tech mogul who had recently acquired Summit Airlines as part of his growing empire. Olivia didn't feel the need to flaunt her wealth or status. She preferred to keep things simple, away from the spotlight her husband's fame often cast on them. She chose to fly commercially today, instead of taking their private jet because it kept her grounded, connected to the world that wasn't shielded by luxury and privilege. "A black coffee, please," Olivia said to the barista at the cafe, pulling out cash to pay instead of swiping her platinum card. The young man behind the counter smiled, recognizing her as a regular. "Heading somewhere nice? Boston? Family celebration?" he asked. "Yep," Olivia replied, dropping her change into the tip jar. "Thanks." Coffee in hand, Olivia made her way toward Gate AA22, her eyes lingering on the various groups around her. Families sat together, elderly couples held hands, and business travelers typed away on their laptops. She appreciated the diversity of people around her, perhaps because she'd grown up in a modest household in rural Colorado before meeting James at a tech conference where she was presenting her environmental research. Back then, she could never have imagined that chance encounter would change her life forever. "Now boarding our first-class passengers for Summit Airlines Flight 782 to Boston," announced the gate agent over the intercom. Olivia gathered her modest carry-on bag, a well-worn backpack, and joined the short line forming at the priority boarding lane. As she approached the gate, a businessman in an expensive suit glanced at her attire, then did a subtle double-take. Olivia was used to these looks by now, and they no longer bothered her. She simply smiled to herself. "Boarding pass, please," the agent asked with a practiced smile as Olivia handed over her phone, displaying the digital boarding pass. The agent scanned it, and for a moment, Olivia noticed the slight hesitation in her smile as she looked between the first-class designation and Olivia's casual appearance. "Thank you, Miss Harris. Enjoy your flight," the agent said, her voice carrying just a hint of doubt. Olivia nodded politely and walked down the jet bridge, unaware that her decision to dress comfortably would soon spark a storm that would change Summit Airlines forever. The first-class cabin of Summit Airlines, Flight 782, gleamed with luxury. Wide leather seats in deep navy blue, polished wood accents, and a serene ambiance filled the space. An attentive flight attendant greeted passengers with pre-departure champagne. As Olivia stepped aboard, the flight attendant, Diane Phillips, looked up from her duties. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw Olivia's casual attire. "Good morning," Olivia said warmly, glancing at her boarding pass. "Seat 2A, by the window." Diane's eyebrows arched slightly in surprise, but she quickly recovered. "First class is to your left," she said, her tone carrying a subtle note of doubt. Olivia simply nodded and moved confidently toward her seat. As she walked past the other passengers, men in business suits, a woman in an elegant dress, and even a celebrity chef Olivia recognized from television, all seemed to glance at her, some in surprise, others in curiosity. Olivia stowed her backpack in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat, pulling out a well-worn paperback instead of a sleek tablet or the latest e-reader. "Excuse me, ma'am," a male flight attendant named Richard approached, his voice low but firm. "May I see your boarding pass?" Olivia looked up, meeting his skeptical gaze. "Of course," she said, pulling up the digital pass again. Richard scrutinized it longer than necessary, glancing between the screen and Olivia's attire. After a brief pause, he said, "One moment, please." He stepped away, speaking in hushed tones with Diane, the gate agent, and a few others at the front of the cabin. Olivia noticed their furtive glances in her direction. The businessman across the aisle pretended not to notice, but his attention was impossible to ignore. Olivia settled into her seat, adjusting her backpack beneath the tray table. She glanced around the cabin, noting the usual first-class passengers, businessmen in crisp suits, an elegant woman sitting across the aisle flipping through a magazine. It was a typical cross-country flight for the elite, where the atmosphere was calm and polite, and everyone had their place. Olivia sighed contentedly, grateful for the chance to be on her own for a while. She opened her paperback, losing herself in the story as the plane began to taxi. But then, just as she was starting to relax, a voice broke her concentration. "Excuse me, ma'am." A male flight attendant named Richard appeared at her side, his tone polite but firm. "May I see your boarding pass?" Olivia looked up from her book, a bit taken aback. "Of course," she replied, pulling out her phone and displaying the digital boarding pass once again. Richard glanced at the screen longer than necessary, his eyes flicking between the pass and her casual attire. He didn't say anything for a moment, but Olivia felt the weight of his gaze. After a few seconds, he turned, heading back to the front of the cabin without another word. Olivia returned to her book, trying to ignore the growing unease in her chest. It was a momentary lapse, she told herself. Just an oversight, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, Richard returned, but this time he was accompanied by Diane Phillips, the senior flight attendant. Diane's smile seemed practiced, but there was something different in her eyes. The friendly, welcoming tone she had earlier was gone, replaced with a more professional, almost detached demeanor. "Ma'am, may I speak with you for a moment?" Diane asked, her voice measured. Olivia closed her book and looked up, sensing where this was heading. She had dealt with situations like this before, but this time it felt different, as if something was brewing just below the surface. Olivia set her book down slowly, feeling the tension in the air. She met Diane's gaze, her own expression calm, though her patience was starting to wear thin. "Of course," Olivia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's the issue?" Diane glanced briefly at Richard before speaking again. "There seems to be some confusion with your boarding pass," she said, her tone professional, but the slight edge in her voice was unmistakable. "Our system occasionally makes errors, but we need to verify your seating assignment." Olivia raised an eyebrow, already sensing the direction this conversation was headed. "There's no confusion," she said, her voice firm but measured. "I'm seated in 2A, first class. My boarding pass has been checked twice already." Richard stood nearby, his arms crossed as he watched the exchange. Olivia could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some of them glancing over with a mix of curiosity and judgment. It was clear the flight attendants had decided that she didn't belong here, not because of her ticket, but because of how she looked. "Miss Harris, perhaps you were accidentally upgraded," Diane suggested, her voice carrying the subtle implication that an upgrade was an unlikely explanation for someone dressed in sweatpants. Olivia could feel her frustration rising, but she kept her composure. "I purchased a first-class ticket," she said evenly. "Is there a dress code I'm unaware of? Because if so, I'd like to know." Diane's smile tightened, and for a moment Olivia saw a flicker of discomfort. "There's no official dress code, Miss Harris," Diane said, her professional veneer slipping just slightly. "But our first-class passengers typically present themselves in a manner that reflects the premium experience." Olivia's voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it now. "So it's not about the ticket I purchased, but how I look." She let the question hang in the air, the weight of it palpable. Across the aisle, a distinguished older gentleman cleared his throat. "I've flown in sweatpants in first class many times," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet authority. "No one's ever questioned my right to be here?" Caroline, the lead flight attendant, who had been observing the situation from the front of the cabin, finally approached. She looked at Olivia, her smile gone entirely, replaced by a cool expression. "Ma'am, we need to ensure that all passengers are in their correct assigned seats," she said, her tone no longer as neutral. "Our system shows this seat should be occupied by an O. Bennett. Is that you?" Olivia's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let them see her frustration. "Yes, I'm Olivia Bennett. You've already verified my boarding pass twice, and I've purchased a first-class ticket. Why am I being singled out?" Caroline faltered for a moment, her expression shifting as the room fell silent. Passengers were watching now, some of them exchanging glances, while others seemed uncomfortable with the growing tension. Olivia stood her ground, her body stiffening as the tension in the cabin mounted. The other passengers were now fully aware of the unfolding drama. Some were watching with undisguised curiosity, while others, like the elderly man across the aisle, exchanged uneasy glances. She could feel their judgment, but it didn't deter her. This was about principle, not comfort or appearance. Olivia Bennett, she repeated, her voice calm but firm. That's who I am. And no, I'm not being upgraded by mistake. I've paid for this seat, and I've gone through the proper channels at the gate. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to find a way to argue against Olivia's clear entitlement to her seat. You're sure there's no confusion? You're not a no-show who was upgraded because your original seat was overbooked? She pressed, as though trying to justify her actions. Olivia's patience was running thin. I'm certain, she replied, her voice steady. This isn't about a mistake in the system. It's about your assumptions about me based on how I'm dressed. The word discrimination hung in the air, unspoken but undeniably present. Olivia knew this wasn't just about a seating mix-up. This was about how she was being treated because she didn't fit the expected image of a first-class passenger. She had seen it before in other people's lives. How often judgment was passed based on clothing, appearance, or background. Today, it was her turn. Richard, who had been standing off to the side with his arms crossed, seemed to stiffen, as if knowing exactly how this would play out. His expression had shifted from one of mere skepticism to something colder. Olivia could feel the collective breath of the cabin held in suspense. Everyone was waiting for the next move, but she refused to back down. Let's not make this difficult, Caroline continued, her tone now bordering on condescension. We're just following standard procedures, Miss Bennett. We need to be certain of your identification. It's policy. The word policy sounded like an excuse, and Olivia wasn't buying it. Her patience had worn thin, and she could no longer pretend that this wasn't personal. She wasn't going to let them get away with treating her like this, not after everything she had endured in her life to get to this point. Olivia's eyes met Caroline's with unwavering calm, though the storm of indignation was simmering just beneath the surface. I don't see why my identity should even be questioned. You've verified my boarding pass twice already. If this were a different situation, would you be treating me like this? Her voice was controlled, but each word carried the weight of years of frustration with systemic bias. Caroline faltered for a moment, visibly uncomfortable under Olivia's gaze. It's just protocol, Miss Bennett, she said, her professionalism slipping as her tone became defensive. We need to be certain that everything is in order. I'm not asking for special treatment, Olivia shot back, but you're treating me like I don't belong here simply because of how I'm dressed. What does my appearance have to do with my ticket? Are first-class seats reserved only for people in suits and ties? The older gentleman across the aisle, who had already spoken up earlier, cleared his throat again, his voice cutting through the tension. I've flown in sweatpants in first class plenty of times, he said firmly, and no one ever questioned me. Exactly, Olivia added, her tone sharp but dignified. If I were wearing pearls and a designer dress, would we even be having this conversation? A murmur rippled through the cabin as other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some cast sympathetic glances in her direction, while others, like the businessman who had been quietly observing, seemed to withdraw into their own worlds, unsure of whether to take sides. Caroline's face flushed, but she kept her composure, though it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of her control. I'm sorry, but we need to follow procedure, she insisted, her voice becoming cold again. If you cannot verify your identity, we will have to reassign you to an economy seat. The words hit Olivia like a slap in the face, but she refused to flinch. She had seen this kind of behavior before. People in power who used their position to belittle those they deemed unworthy, simply because of their own narrow-minded perceptions. But today, she wasn't going to let them get away with it. Olivia stood up slowly, gathering her backpack. Fine, she said, her voice calm but resolute. I'll move to economy, but I want your names and employee numbers. This is not over. As she made her way down the aisle, escorted by Diane, she noticed the mixed reactions from the other passengers. Some watched with sympathy, while others were clearly uncomfortable with what had just transpired. The elderly gentleman across the aisle shook his head in disgust, his disappointment clear. Olivia held her head high, though every step she took felt like it was shattering the last remnants of her dignity. But she wouldn't back down. Olivia arrived home later that evening, her mind a whirl of emotions. The events of the flight were still fresh in her mind. The humiliation, the condescending tones, and the stares of the other passengers. She had tried to shake it off, but the sting of being judged so harshly because of how she looked was difficult to ignore. It wasn't just about a mistake on the part of the airline. It was about something deeper, something insidious that ran through the very fabric of their society, the tendency to judge based on appearances. As she walked into the spacious, modern living room of their San Francisco penthouse, she was greeted by James, who was sitting on the sofa, his eyes glued to his laptop. He looked up at her, and immediately the concern in his eyes was palpable. "Olivia," he said, his voice low and serious, "how was your flight?" She dropped her bag on the floor and sat beside him, rubbing her temples. "It wasn't great," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I was humiliated by the staff. They questioned my right to be in first class because I was dressed in sweatpants. It was ridiculous." James's face darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening. He had always been protective of Olivia, but hearing about what had happened to her stung deeply. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice low with controlled anger. "Do they not know who you are? The fact that they would treat you like that, it's disgraceful." Olivia shook her head. "It's not about who I am, James. It's about how I look. They saw me in casual clothes and immediately assumed I didn't belong there." Her voice broke slightly as she continued. "I didn't want to make a scene, but I had no choice. It was humiliating." James sat silently for a moment, processing what she had said. He could feel the tension radiating from her, and he knew she was holding back more than she let on. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. James took a deep breath, his mind already racing through solutions. He hated seeing Olivia like this, his strong, composed wife, reduced to feeling powerless by something so trivial as a difference in appearance. He knew how hard it had been for her to navigate life in a world that often didn't understand her simplicity, her desire to blend in rather than stand out. "Olivia," James said, his voice steady but firm, "this isn't just about what happened today. It's bigger than that. It's about the way people treat each other based on assumptions. If this is happening to you, I can only imagine how many others are suffering in silence." His tone was a mixture of anger and resolve. Olivia looked at him, her eyes still clouded with frustration. "I'm not looking for revenge, James. I don't want to use your name to get back at them. I just want things to change. I don't want anyone else to have to go through what I did." James nodded slowly. "I understand, but this isn't something that's going to fix itself quietly. I'm going to handle it. I won't stand by and let my company, let my airline, treat people like this. This is personal for me now." His eyes softened as he spoke, his love for her evident. "I'll make sure that no one else goes through what you did." Olivia placed a hand on his. "I don't want you to do this just because of me," she said quietly. "I want you to do it because it's the right thing. I want you to change the culture, to show people that it's not about appearance or status." James's eyes gleamed with determination. "You're right. This isn't just about you. This is about everyone who's ever been made to feel less than because they didn't fit the image someone else expected of them." He stood up, pacing as his mind began to work on the steps ahead. "I'm going to make some calls. We'll address this directly, and we'll do it in a way that changes the system, not just the incident." Olivia watched him, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "Thank you, James. I knew you'd understand." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." James paused in front of her, his eyes softening. "We will. We're going to change things, Olivia. Starting now." The determination in his eyes filled Olivia with a quiet hope. She knew James would fight for this. It wasn't just about fixing one wrong. It was about making a statement, about ensuring that people would be treated with dignity and respect, no matter their appearance, their wealth, or their status. The following morning, the offices of Summit Airlines were abuzz with activity. The sleek glass and steel building in downtown San Francisco gleamed in the early light, a symbol of the company's rise in the airline industry. Inside, the boardroom was filled with executives, department heads, and key staff members. Everyone knew today's quarterly review would be different. It wasn't just about numbers or performance metrics this time. James Harris was here in person, and that fact alone had everyone on edge. Patricia Winters, Summit's chief customer officer, shuffled through the agenda, her hands slightly trembling. She had worked in customer experience for years, but she had never been more anxious for a meeting than she was today. The incident with Olivia was still fresh, and she knew it would be discussed. The last thing she wanted was to face James's wrath. "Patricia, the board members will be here shortly," her assistant reminded her, noticing the way Patricia kept glancing nervously at the clock. "Mr. Harris confirmed that he'll be attending in person." Patricia nodded, her stomach sinking at the thought of facing James. She had spent the last few hours reviewing customer complaints, particularly those related to staff behavior. The numbers weren't promising. Complaints had increased by 11% from the previous quarter, with attitudes from employees being the top issue. She knew this was where the real challenge lay. James Harris was known for his unwavering commitment to excellence, and if his employees weren't up to standard, there would be consequences. Meanwhile, James was in his penthouse, getting ready for the meeting. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his navy suit, his expression calm but focused. Olivia was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching him as he made final adjustments to his tie. "You sure you don't want me to talk to the flight attendants directly?" James asked, glancing over his shoulder. His voice carried the low, controlled anger of a man who was both protective and deeply troubled by the events that had unfolded. Olivia shook her head. "This isn't about personal revenge, Alex," she said, using his nickname. "It's about something bigger. I want to change the culture, not just punish a few people. We need to show them that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable, that we're not going to tolerate discrimination just because of someone's appearance." James looked at her for a moment, his face softening. He had always admired Olivia's ability to see beyond the surface, to approach problems with a clarity that he admired. "You're right," he said, adjusting his tie one last time. "We'll do it your way. This isn't just about those flight attendants. It's about changing the system." Olivia smiled softly, her faith in him unwavering. "Thanks, Alex. I know you'll handle it." James gave a small nod, checking his watch. "The meeting starts in an hour. Are you sure about the timing?" "I'm sure," Olivia replied, standing up and straightening his tie, even though it didn't need adjusting. "Let's get this over with. The change has to start now." As the meeting began, the large conference room at Summit Airlines headquarters buzzed with nervous energy. Around the polished table sat a group of executives, managers, and department heads, each of them aware that today's review would be unlike any other. The board members arrived promptly, their serious expressions setting the tone for what was to come. Patricia Winters, despite her professional demeanor, felt the pressure mounting. She had spent the last few hours rehearsing what she'd say, but deep down, she knew that this was no longer just about numbers or customer satisfaction scores. "Thank you all for joining today's quarterly review," Patricia began, her voice steady, though she could feel the tension in the air. She quickly moved through the introductory slides, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "As you can see, our first-class service remains one of the highest-rated sectors in the industry. But we have a challenge. Customer complaints have increased by 11%, with staff attitude being the most common concern." She clicked to the next slide, which displayed customer satisfaction metrics. But there was no hiding the discomfort that had taken root. She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably as she knew the next slide would be even more difficult. "Now, I'd like to highlight our first-class team, which has historically been our strongest asset," Patricia continued, her voice tightening with each word. "This is where we've seen the best customer feedback and the highest ratings." She motioned toward Caroline Reynolds, the senior first-class manager, and her team. Caroline and her team have been instrumental in maintaining these high standards, and we'd like to hear from her now on the continued success of the service. Caroline stood, her heels clicking against the floor as she moved toward the front of the room. She flashed a confident smile, though Olivia's earlier treatment on the flight still weighed heavily on her mind. Her words were practiced, polished. "Thank you, Patricia," Caroline said, addressing the room. "At Summit Airlines, we believe that the first-class experience begins the moment our passengers step on board. We work hard to anticipate the needs of our premium customers, and we pride ourselves on offering them a level of service that reflects our brand's commitment to excellence. She moved through her presentation, discussing training programs, customer service procedures, and high customer satisfaction ratings. But as she continued, she could feel James's eyes on her. His gaze was sharp, observant, and unyielding, sending a chill through her spine. Just as Caroline finished explaining the importance of maintaining the exclusive atmosphere in the first-class cabin, the door to the conference room opened. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward the doorway. There, standing in the doorway, was Olivia, dressed in the same dark gray sweatshirt, light gray sweatpants, and black cap she had worn on the flight the day before. A murmur spread through the room as people realized who she was. Caroline faltered mid-sentence. Her carefully composed words caught in her throat. Recognition dawned on her face, followed by confusion. Richard and Diane, who were seated at the back of the room, exchanged alarmed glances, clearly startled by the unexpected appearance of the woman who had been at the center of the controversy just 24 hours earlier. James stood from his seat at the head of the table, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his voice cool but unwavering. "I believe some of you have already met my wife, Olivia." The room froze, stunned silence hanging in the air as Olivia stepped into the room, her presence commanding yet unassuming. She walked confidently to stand beside her husband, still wearing the very clothes that had been judged as inappropriate just the day before. "Olivia flew from Denver to Boston yesterday on our airline in first class," James continued, his voice firm and clear, letting every word land with weight. "And as you can see, she's here today, still dressed exactly as she was yesterday." The shock was palpable. Executives exchanged looks, some of them trying to piece together the connection. Caroline's professional composure cracked, and she stared blankly ahead, unsure of how to proceed. James turned his gaze to Caroline, who was now visibly struggling to recover. "Caroline," he said, his tone casual but firm, "perhaps you would like to explain Summit Airlines' approach to premium customer service?" The room was thick with tension. Every person at the table was waiting, holding their breath, uncertain about what would happen next. Olivia stood beside James, her presence commanding. Yet there was an undeniable calm about her. She had already made her point clear the day before, but now it was time for others to face the consequences of their actions. James, who had been a pillar of strength beside her, turned his attention back to Caroline and the others in the room, his expression unreadable. Caroline, clearly flustered, stood at the front of the room, her confidence shattered. She had prided herself on maintaining the highest standards of service, but now the very foundation of her professionalism was being questioned in front of her peers. I'm not sure what you expect from me, Mr. Harris," she said, trying to gather her composure. "I was simply following protocol. We treat our first-class passengers with a certain level of respect, and I didn't think—" "You didn't think," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "That's the problem, Caroline. You didn't think. You didn't think about the person sitting in front of you. You didn't think about the message you were sending. And most importantly, you didn't think about the values of this company." Olivia's eyes never left Caroline as she listened to James's words. There was a quiet strength in her gaze, a sense of quiet determination that had always been a part of her, even before she had met James. She had worked hard to build her own sense of worth and self-respect, and now she was watching someone else come face to face with the consequences of their actions. Caroline's face flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. What could she possibly say in response? Her actions, which she had justified as following protocol, were now laid bare in front of her, and there was no excuse that would work. She glanced at the other flight attendants, Richard and Diane, who both seemed uncomfortable in their seats, clearly knowing that this wasn't going to end well for any of them. "Caroline," James continued, his voice softening just slightly but still firm, "I'm not here to point fingers. What I want, what we need, is accountability. This isn't about firing people or making an example out of them. This is about making sure that no one else, no matter who they are or how they dress, ever feels like they don't belong on our planes." Olivia nodded, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. I want to make it clear, she added, her voice steady but powerful. This isn't just about my experience. This is about a culture of bias that's been allowed to fester in our industry for far too long. If we don't address this now, we're going to keep seeing the same problems again and again. The room remained silent as Olivia's words hung in the air. The gravity of the situation was clear to everyone present. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked down at their hands, unable to meet Olivia's eyes. The uncomfortable truth had been laid bare. This wasn't just a single incident with one flight attendant, but a systemic issue that needed to be confronted. Caroline shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Olivia and James. I didn't mean for it to be this way, she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. I was just trying to maintain the standard. Our passengers expect a certain level of professionalism, and I didn't. Professionalism? James interrupted sharply. Is professionalism about treating people based on the clothes they wear? Or is it about treating every passenger with dignity and respect, no matter their background, appearance, or status? Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She knew deep down that her actions had been more about assumptions than standards. The realization settled on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She had failed not only Olivia, but everyone who had ever felt judged based on their appearance. James's gaze softened slightly as he turned to the other flight attendants, Richard and Diane, who had been silent up to this point. I'm not blind to the fact that this issue goes beyond one person, he said, his voice firm but understanding. Caroline, Richard, Diane, you're all part of this culture. It's not just her fault. It's about the way we all think and how we all need to change. The three flight attendants exchanged looks, but no one spoke. They understood now that the problem wasn't just about a single misstep. It was about the larger issue of bias that had been ingrained in the company's culture for years. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again, James said, his voice decisive. We will be implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff. This is a company-wide initiative, and it starts now. Every employee, from the ground crew to the flight attendants, will be held accountable. There will be no more tolerating judgment based on appearance. Olivia stepped forward, her voice steady but resolute. This isn't about punishment, she said, addressing the room. It's about education. It's about teaching people how to see others as human beings, not as stereotypes. The work starts with us. It's not just about changing one person's behavior. It's about changing the way we all think. The room was quiet, the weight of Olivia's words sinking in. The tension that had filled the room at the start of the meeting was slowly dissipating, replaced by a sense of resolve. Change was coming, and it was going to start right here, right now. As the meeting came to a close, James looked at the flight attendants one last time. You three, he said, his voice firm but not unkind, will be reassigned for the next month. You'll work closely with our customer advocacy team, addressing complaints and learning what it truly means to provide service to everyone, regardless of how they look. Caroline, Richard, and Diane nodded silently, their faces a mixture of shame and resignation. They knew what had been asked of them was not easy, but it was necessary. James turned to the rest of the room, his expression one of quiet determination. We'll make sure this company lives up to the values we claim to uphold. We'll do it by educating our staff, improving our feedback system, and ensuring that no one ever feels the way Olivia did on that flight. As the meeting adjourned, Olivia stayed by James's side, her heart swelling with pride. She had fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged by superficial standards. And today, she knew, was the first step toward a change that could echo far beyond the walls of Summit Airlines. The following weeks after the meeting at Summit Airlines headquarters were tense but transformative. The company, shaken by the events surrounding Olivia's treatment, had begun the process of implementing sweeping changes. It wasn't just about adding new policies or altering protocols. It was about shifting a deeply ingrained culture that had allowed bias to thrive under the surface. James and Olivia had both committed themselves to the long, difficult task of making sure the changes would stick, and it began with education. Summit Airlines launched a comprehensive anti-bias training program, one that would be mandatory for all employees, from ground crew to upper management. The program was designed not just to address discrimination, but to challenge the very assumptions that led to biased behavior in the first place. It wasn't about condemning people for their past actions, but about creating a new way of thinking, one that focused on empathy, equality, and respect. Olivia, while not directly involved in the training sessions, found herself attending a few of them, helping to answer questions and sharing her own experience. She was determined to show that change was possible, that transformation came not just from rules, but from personal connection and understanding. Meanwhile, the flight attendants who had been involved in her incident, Caroline, Richard, and Diane, were assigned to work with the customer advocacy team. They were given the responsibility of handling complaints and learning firsthand the impact of their actions on passengers. It was a humbling experience for them, but one that had the potential to make them better at their jobs, and better people too. For Caroline, the training was especially challenging. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, but the reality of what she had done to Olivia hit her hard. Every story she heard from passengers who had been treated unfairly, every case of bias that had gone unnoticed, felt like a mirror reflecting her own actions. She struggled with the guilt, but also recognized that this was her opportunity to change, to become someone who saw the full humanity of every passenger, regardless of their appearance. As the weeks went by, the changes at Summit Airlines became more noticeable. The company's new commitment to equality and respect for all passengers began to show in small but meaningful ways. Complaints decreased, and passengers seemed more at ease, no longer worried that they would be judged for their appearance or background. It wasn't a perfect transformation overnight, but the shift in culture was undeniable. James continued to work closely with the leadership team, monitoring the progress of the new training initiatives and ensuring that accountability measures were put into place. He was dedicated to the long-term success of the company, but more than that, he wanted to ensure that Summit Airlines was setting an example for the entire industry. He believed that true leadership came from doing what was right, not what was easy. Olivia, too, found herself increasingly involved in the company's efforts. She had always stayed in the background, supporting James, but now she felt a deeper connection to the cause. She realized that her fight for change wasn't over. While the treatment she had received on the plane had been deeply painful, it had sparked something much larger, a movement for justice and fairness in an industry that was often blind to its biases. One morning, as Olivia sat in a quiet corner of their penthouse, sipping her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message from James. It was short, but the weight of it was enough to make her heart race. It's working. Later that day, as James attended another company meeting, he could see the difference in the way the staff interacted with one another. There was a newfound respect in the air, a sense of unity that had been lacking before. The training wasn't just a checkbox anymore. It had become a shift in how everyone viewed their role in the company. It wasn't about delivering the best service to the wealthy and famous, but to everyone who stepped onto a Summit Airlines plane. Even Caroline, once the embodiment of the old culture, seemed to have found a new sense of humility. She had spent hours working alongside the customer advocacy team, fielding complaints and listening to passengers share their stories. She had come to realize just how wrong she had been to judge people based on their appearance, and she had started to change her approach. Not just in her work, but in her daily life. She felt a deep sense of responsibility now, one that was rooted in empathy rather than superiority. As the months passed, Summit Airlines' reputation began to grow, not just for its luxury service, but for its genuine commitment to equality and inclusion. Olivia had fought for this change not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible or lesser than because of how they looked. The victory wasn't in the way people now treated her, but in the way they were treating one another. One day, as Olivia boarded another Summit Airlines flight, she noticed something that made her smile. A young woman dressed casually in a vintage t-shirt and jeans was being treated with the same level of respect and courtesy as the business executives in suits. No one questioned her right to be there. No one made assumptions about her. It was the kind of change Olivia had hoped for, the kind of world she wanted to help create. As the flight took off, Olivia gazed out the window, a sense of peace settling over her. She had helped create something bigger than herself, something that would continue to grow and affect countless lives. And as she sat there, Content in the knowledge that change was possible, she knew her work was far from over. This was only the beginning. It had been a month since the changes began at Summit Airlines, and the transformation was already evident. The training sessions had become more than just mandatory workshops. They had sparked deep conversations within the company. Employees from all departments were engaged, sharing their thoughts and personal stories about bias, privilege, and the ways in which they could improve their own behaviors. It wasn't just a corporate initiative anymore. It had become a movement within the organization, a shift in mindset that was spreading beyond just customer-facing staff. James stood in his office looking over the latest customer satisfaction reports. The numbers were up substantially. Complaints had decreased, and passengers were now speaking more positively about their experiences, particularly in the context of how they were treated by the crew. The airline was slowly gaining a reputation not only for its luxury service, but for its commitment to inclusivity and respect for all passengers, regardless of their background or appearance. But the change hadn't been easy. There were still skeptics within the company, those who saw the new initiatives as a passing trend or a distraction from the bottom line. James knew it would take time for the culture to shift completely, but he was determined to see it through. He knew the benefits of what they were doing would far outweigh the short-term discomfort. Olivia, meanwhile, had been quietly observing the changes herself. While she had never sought the spotlight, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far things had come. She'd seen firsthand how the new training had affected some of the flight attendants, Carolyn, Richard, and Diane included. They had all shown growth, though it wasn't without its struggles. Caroline especially seemed to be trying harder, actively engaging with passengers in a way that was less about service and more about human connection. It was clear to Olivia that the real work was not over. The ripple effect of their actions was still in its infancy, and the true test would come when the entire industry took notice of what Summit Airlines was doing. If they could prove that this approach worked, they would have set a precedent that might change the way air travel was experienced by everyone. As the weeks passed, Summit Airlines became a symbol of progress within the industry. Word about their new inclusive approach to customer service had spread, first through word of mouth and then through media outlets. Olivia had been invited to speak at a conference on corporate responsibility, and James was often approached by other CEOs and industry leaders, curious about the changes they had implemented and eager to learn how they could follow suit. One afternoon, as Olivia sat at the airport cafe waiting for her flight, a woman approached her hesitantly. The woman was dressed casually in a simple hoodie and jeans, her hands clasped nervously. She looked around as if unsure whether to speak up, but then her eyes locked onto Olivia's, and she walked over. "Excuse me, I hope I'm not bothering you," the woman said, her voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. I flew on Summit Airlines a few weeks ago, and I was treated with so much respect. I've never felt so welcomed, especially in first class. I don't usually travel like that, and I was so afraid I'd be judged because of my appearance. But the crew was so kind. I just wanted to thank you." Olivia was momentarily taken aback. It was one thing to hear about the changes through reports and statistics, but it was entirely different to hear it from a passenger who had experienced it firsthand. She smiled warmly at the woman, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm so glad to hear that," Olivia replied. "It's the least we can do. Everyone deserves to feel valued, no matter what they're wearing or where they're from." The woman's eyes glistened as she nodded. "It means more than you know. I can't tell you how many times I've been treated differently because of how I look. But now it's like the world's a little bit smaller, a little bit kinder. Thank you for making that happen." As the woman walked away, Olivia sat back, reflecting on the moment. This was the ripple effect she had been hoping for. The small act of standing up for herself had sparked something bigger, a cultural shift that was now reaching people in unexpected ways. Summit Airlines was no longer just an airline. It had become a platform for change, a symbol of what could happen when empathy and respect were prioritized over appearance and preconceived notions. Later that day, James received a call from a competitor, one of the largest airlines in the country. They had heard about Summit's success and wanted to learn more. James couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They weren't just making waves in their own company anymore. They were influencing the entire industry. "This is just the beginning," he said to Olivia that evening, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We've set a new standard. Now it's up to everyone else to catch up." Olivia smiled, feeling the weight of their journey and the long road still ahead. "I think they'll come around, but we'll be ready when they do." As the night fell over San Francisco, the future seemed full of possibilities. Summit Airlines had become a beacon for change, and though they had made significant strides, Olivia and James knew that the work wasn't finished yet. The industry was watching them, and the real challenge would be keeping this momentum alive, ensuring that respect and inclusivity remained at the forefront of their mission. But for the first time in a long while, Olivia felt confident that the change they had started was unstoppable. It had been several months since the changes at Summit Airlines had begun to take root, and the company was beginning to see tangible results. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and complaints about staff behavior had drastically decreased. But the true test was yet to come. Could the company maintain its new culture as it grew, or would the old biases creep back in when things got busy, when it was easier to overlook the work they had put in? James and Olivia had been keeping a close eye on the company's progress, ensuring that the changes were being fully embraced at every level. The feedback from employees had been largely positive, but there were still some areas where the shift in mindset hadn't yet taken hold. The higher-ups were on board, but how would the staff in the trenches, those who had been the most resistant to change, react when the pressure of day-to-day operations mounted again? One afternoon, James was sitting in his office, reviewing quarterly projections, when he received a call from Patricia Winters, the chief customer officer. Her voice was strained, and it was clear that something was bothering her. "James," she began, "I need to talk to you about something concerning the new staff training." James leaned back in his chair, frowning slightly. "What's going on, Patricia?" "There's been a report about a few incidents that suggest we may not be fully seeing the results we expected," Patricia continued, her voice tight. "A couple of our mid-level managers are claiming that some of the new hires are struggling to adapt to the changes. There's been talk that the anti-bias training isn't sticking as well as we thought, especially among some of our flight attendants." James listened carefully, trying to process the information. He knew this would be a difficult conversation, but he was determined not to let it deter their progress. "You're telling me that some of our new hires aren't fully on board?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. "Not exactly," Patricia responded. "It's more that the pressure of the job, the long hours, and the fast-paced environment are making it hard for some to implement what they've learned. It's like the training is being pushed to the background when things get hectic." James rubbed his temples. This was the challenge he had been anticipating, the real test. "We can't let that happen. The culture change has to be part of everything we do, every day, not just something we do when it's convenient." James knew that they were at a critical juncture. The real challenge wasn't just about getting the training in place, but about ensuring that the new mindset would endure and become a part of the daily operations, even when the pressure mounted. He couldn't afford for this to be just another initiative that lost momentum over time. "We can't backtrack," he said firmly, leaning forward in his chair. "This is about more than just changing behavior for a few months. It's about making sure this becomes a part of the foundation of how we do business. I don't care how busy we get. We need to reinforce this at every level." "I agree," Patricia replied, her tone softening. "But we need to provide more support for the staff who are struggling. Maybe additional workshops, or perhaps some mentorship from senior team members who've really embraced the changes." James nodded thoughtfully. "I'll address this directly. We'll make sure there's a constant reminder of the core values in everything we do. We'll set up more regular check-ins and create smaller focus groups to help people understand the importance of keeping this culture alive." The next day, James and Olivia held a town hall meeting with employees from all departments to discuss the current state of the company's cultural shift. James spoke passionately about their shared mission, urging everyone to stay committed to the values of respect, equality, and inclusion, no matter how busy or demanding their jobs became. Olivia, too, spoke from the heart, sharing her personal experience and the importance of building a workplace where everyone felt seen and valued. "These values are non-negotiable," James said, his voice steady and strong. "It's not just about making Summit Airlines a great place for our customers. It's about making it a great place for our employees too. We can't let anything we've worked for slip away. We're in this together, and together we'll make sure this culture remains at the core of everything we do. The town hall was a turning point. Employees who had been unsure about the new initiatives started to see that James and Olivia were fully committed to seeing this through. They weren't just saying the right things. They were putting in the work to ensure that the culture they had promised was lived every day. It was clear now that this wasn't just a corporate initiative, it was a movement, and the people who truly embraced it were starting to lead by example. But there were still challenges ahead. Not everyone would immediately buy into the new way of thinking, and as Summit Airlines grew, maintaining the integrity of the culture would require constant vigilance. James and Olivia knew that they couldn't afford to grow complacent. They had to stay ahead of the curve, ensuring that the company stayed true to its values, no matter how fast it expanded. As the meeting wrapped up, James looked around the room, feeling a deep sense of pride. There was a real shift happening, one that was beginning to ripple outward. But he knew the road ahead would require even more effort, more patience, and more leadership. Still, he was confident that the company was heading in the right direction. The true test would be in the months to come, but with a unified team and a clear mission, he believed Summit Airlines was ready for the challenge. The months following the town hall meeting had been a defining period for Summit Airlines. The company's commitment to inclusivity and respect was no longer just an idea or a series of training workshops. It had become a living, breathing part of the company's culture. While the transition hadn't been entirely smooth, the progress they had made was undeniable. James and Olivia found themselves in a new rhythm, constantly balancing the growth of the company with the integrity of its core values. They had worked hard to ensure that Summit Airlines wasn't just another corporate giant focused on profits and efficiency, but a company that genuinely cared about its people, its employees, its customers, and the communities they served. But even with the progress, the challenges weren't over. The airline was expanding rapidly, and as it grew, so did the complexity of maintaining the culture they had worked so hard to establish. There were always new hires to train, new systems to integrate, and the looming pressure to perform financially. Olivia sat at her desk one afternoon, reviewing feedback from recent customer surveys. The numbers were overwhelmingly positive, but as always, there were a few complaints. Discontent with the boarding process, confusion about seating arrangements, and occasional reports of delays. Yet what struck her was the number of comments praising the crew's demeanor, their kindness, and their willingness to go the extra mile to make passengers feel welcome. She couldn't help but smile as she read through the messages. These were the changes she had hoped for, the ones that reflected not just the company's training, but the people who had internalized it and made it their own. Olivia had always believed that true change came from within, and seeing it in action, in the stories from passengers, made her feel like their work was paying off. But there was still more to do. The airline was growing into a model for others to follow, but the pressure of success was mounting. James had already been approached by several competitors wanting to know more about Summit's approach to employee engagement and customer service. He knew that they had set a precedent that was impossible to ignore. But with that came the responsibility to stay ahead of the curve and continue leading the way. One evening, after another busy day of meetings and planning, James and Olivia found themselves at the dinner table, discussing the future of Summit Airlines. The weight of the company's growth and the pressure to maintain their core values hung over them. The stakes were higher now, not just for them personally, but for the entire team that had embraced this cultural shift. "Do you ever think about how different things are now?" Olivia asked, stirring her glass of wine thoughtfully. "When we first started, it felt like such a distant dream to make this kind of change. But now, we're leading the charge. It's incredible." James nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on his glass. "It is incredible," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. "But we can't get complacent. This company has the chance to change the entire industry, but only if we continue to push forward. We can't afford to let this become a buzzword. It has to be more than a slogan. It needs to be in everything we do." Olivia's eyes shone with determination. "Exactly. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone at Summit, from the flight attendants to the ground crew, from customer service reps to senior management. If we slip, if we let the culture shift for convenience, we risk everything. James leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. I know, and that's why we're here. Not just to build an airline, but to create something that lasts, something that stands for more than just luxury flights. They paused for a moment, taking in the gravity of their words. Olivia had always believed that change began with individuals, but it was clear now that the scale of their work was greater than she had imagined. They had ignited a fire, one that was beginning to spread beyond the walls of Summit Airlines, and the industry was watching closely. As the evening wore on, they talked about the next steps, how to ensure that the company's values didn't just survive, but thrived as Summit Airlines expanded. The internal training programs needed to be updated regularly. The mentorship system had to be strengthened, and the company's feedback system would need to evolve to capture more nuanced concerns about bias and customer treatment. What do you think will be the biggest challenge moving forward? Olivia asked. James thought for a moment. Maintaining this level of personal commitment across such a large organization? As we grow, we can't lose sight of the human element. We have to make sure that the people we hire believe in this culture as deeply as we do. Olivia smiled. And we'll find them. We'll keep building, making sure that Summit is not just a company, but a force for real change. They sat in comfortable silence, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but feeling more confident than ever in their ability to lead it. Summit Airlines had become a model for inclusivity and respect, and now they were ready to set their sights on making that vision a reality on an even larger scale. The air in Summit Airlines headquarters was thick with anticipation as James stood at the head of the conference table. The company was on the brink of its biggest challenge yet, an industry-wide test of the new cultural values they had worked so hard to establish. While the changes at Summit Airlines had already garnered attention, the upcoming launch of a new transcontinental flight route would be a true proving ground. This was their chance to prove that the values of inclusivity, respect, and equality weren't just part of a marketing strategy, but were the foundation of everything they did. James glanced around the table at the key leaders of Summit Airlines, each of them looking back at him with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. This was the first time they would be rolling out their new service standards on a wide scale, and they couldn't afford any missteps. The pressure was immense. We've made incredible progress, James began, his voice steady but resolute. But we all know that the real test comes now. This new flight route will be a reflection of everything we stand for. Our commitment to inclusivity, to treating every passenger with dignity, no matter their background or appearance, it's all on the line. Olivia, seated beside him, nodded. She had been watching the team as they prepared for this launch, noting the subtle signs of doubt and concern in some of the more seasoned members of the leadership team. While the cultural shift had been embraced by many, there were still others who questioned whether the company could continue to hold these values as they expanded. Now is the time to show the world that this isn't just a program, but the future of air travel, Olivia added, her voice carrying the same weight of determination as James's. The way we handle these next few months will set the tone for the rest of Summit's journey. A few of the department heads exchanged glances. It was clear they understood the importance of what was about to happen, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. They had been trained to think about efficiency, profitability, and performance metrics. Now they were being asked to prioritize empathy, respect, and equality, all while maintaining the company's financial goals. James noticed the hesitation, the unsaid questions that lingered in the room. He knew this was where the true test of leadership would begin. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he continued, his eyes meeting those of each department head around the table. I know there are still doubts. This shift in culture, this approach, is unlike anything our industry has seen, but that's exactly why it's so important. We can't just be another airline. We have the opportunity to redefine what it means to treat people well, not only the elite or those in first class, but everyone who steps onto our planes. He paused, letting his words sink in. Our success in this new route isn't just about the service or the customer experience. It's about making every passenger feel valued, whether they're in business class, economy, or a family of 4 with toddlers. This is where we prove that the change we've made is sustainable. This is where we prove that our culture isn't just something we talk about, It's something we live. There was a silence in the room, a collective breath held as the weight of the challenge fully settled in. James could see the skepticism in some faces. These were people who had spent years focusing on the mechanics of business, not necessarily the softer, more intangible aspects of human connection, but this was the moment for them to step into the new era of Summit Airlines. We've put the right structures in place, and we've invested in training, Olivia added. But now it's up to each of you to make sure that this isn't just an initiative. It has to be in everything we do, every decision we make. The flight attendants, the pilots, the ground crew, they need to feel this culture too. We all need to model the behaviors we've promised. A hand was raised across the table, and Diane, a senior leader in customer relations, spoke up. James, Olivia, we understand the vision, but what if we run into resistance on the ground? What if the customer-facing staff, who weren't in those initial workshops, start to struggle with putting this into practice when the pressure hits? James nodded, anticipating that question. That's why this needs to be an ongoing process, not a one-time thing. We can't stop reinforcing these values. We will have regular check-ins with every team, creating a feedback loop to make sure that if we notice challenges, we address them immediately. We've built this company on the foundation of honesty and open communication, and that needs to extend to our training and accountability too. Olivia spoke next, her tone unwavering. We're not expecting perfection. We're expecting effort, and when mistakes happen, we need to use them as learning opportunities, not as reasons to let go of the values we're trying to instill. The only way this works is if we're consistent and we trust the people we've trained. The conversation continued with more practical details: flight schedules, team coordination, and customer service expectations. But underneath all of it was the shared commitment to proving that Summit Airlines could truly deliver on its promise of inclusivity. They had set a precedent that wasn't just about luxury, it was about human connection. As the meeting came to a close, James and Olivia exchanged a glance. There was still much work to be done, but the leadership team was beginning to understand that this new vision wasn't just a set of rules. It was a commitment to something far bigger. Summit Airlines wasn't just trying to keep up with the competition, they were setting the standard for the entire industry. As the room cleared out and the team returned to their work, James pulled Olivia aside. I know it won't be easy, but we've already made it this far. The hardest part is over. Olivia smiled, but there was a quiet, resolute confidence in her eyes. The hardest part is never over, James. But together, we'll make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. And with that, they both turned to face the challenges ahead, confident that they had created something that could withstand any test the future held. It was the day of Summit Airlines' grand relaunch. The new transcontinental flight route, the one that had been months in the making, was about to take off. James and Olivia stood in the terminal, watching the staff bustle with excitement and nervous energy. The anticipation was palpable, but underneath it all, there was a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. This flight wasn't just about flying passengers from one city to another. It was a test. It was the culmination of everything they had worked toward, the changes they had made, the culture they had built, the values they had instilled in their employees. Today, they had to prove that this wasn't just a passing moment or a marketing campaign. It was their new normal. Are you ready for this? James asked, his voice calm but laced with anticipation. Olivia nodded, though she felt the weight of the day bearing down on her. I think so, but we'll see, won't we? This is the big moment, James. If we can get this right, we'll have truly changed the industry. They walked through the terminal, their eyes scanning the faces of employees, some familiar and some new, all working together with the same goal in mind. Olivia's heart swelled with pride. The flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, and customer service teams were all aligned with the mission. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about delivering an experience that reflected the company's values at every touchpoint. As they approached the gate, the final checks were being made. The crew was ready, and passengers were beginning to board, unaware of the significance this flight would carry for Summit Airlines. For the first time in a long while, Olivia felt the calm before the storm. She knew the challenges would come, but she was ready for them. This is it, she said softly. Let's see if we've really built something sustainable. James squeezed her hand, offering a small but reassuring smile. We've built more than that. We've built a foundation. And with that, they watched as the first passengers of Summit Airlines' new era began to board the plane. As the plane prepared for takeoff, James and Olivia stood by the gate, observing the final moments before the flight's departure. The staff was moving with precision, helping passengers settle in, and the calm efficiency was a testament to how far the company had come. Olivia glanced at James, a quiet pride in her eyes. They had come a long way from that first moment on the plane, the one that had set everything in motion. Now everything they had worked for was being tested on a much larger scale. We've come a long way, Olivia said, her voice full of quiet satisfaction. We sure have, James replied, his gaze fixed on the aircraft. But we're not done yet. Today is just the beginning. This flight and every flight after it will define the legacy of Summit Airlines. The aircraft doors closed, signaling that the last passengers had boarded. James and Olivia turned and made their way to the observation deck, where they would watch the flight depart. The first few moments would be crucial. Any disruptions, any breakdowns in service would be scrutinized. But deep down, Olivia knew that their team was prepared. They had put in the work, they had embraced the new culture, and now it was time to see it in action. The plane slowly began to taxi toward the runway, and a wave of emotion washed over Olivia. This was what it was all about. They had set out to create something that wasn't just profitable, but meaningful. They had worked to build a culture that would be remembered long after the first-class cabins and luxurious amenities were gone. It was about more than just providing a premium service. It was about providing a premium experience for everyone, regardless of who they were. As the plane took off, the sound of the engines roaring to life filled the room. James put his arm around Olivia, pulling her close. We did it, he said quietly. She nodded, watching the plane climb higher into the sky. We've only just begun. And as they stood there watching the plane soar into the horizon, they knew that Summit Airlines was more than just a company now. It was a movement, and it had only just begun.